Hi, everybody. I'm Scott,
And I'm Luke.
And I'm Jonathan.
and this is the No Way to Hollywood podcast. Thanks for joining us.
We are glad that you are taking time out of your valuable day to join us.
We are glad about that.
I'm so glad, in fact, that I'm going to give you a rating of excellent. Okay, that was supposed to be a cute little segue into our topic for the show.
I thought about doing something like that, and then I didn't do it. That's the difference between.
I've written a segue once. It was smoother than that, Scott.
Oh. Well, tonight we are talking about movie ratings. So just a brief history, the movie rating system is actually done by the Organization of Motion Picture Distributors. And this initial rating system came about in around 1968 and has evolved a little bit since then to the current system that we have today. Obviously, the ratings start with G, which is a general audience, good for everyone. PG stands for parental guidance, and movies there usually have some slightly more difficult topics. PG-13 is a slightly higher rating than that for parents to be cautious with kids under 13 years of age specifically. R movies means restricted, and typically that means that if you are under the age of 17, you must be accompanied by an adult. And then there is NC-17, which is the straight up no children under 17. So, guys, let's get into our feelings on ratings. Is this a good thing? Are they bad? Why or why not?
That's a loaded subject that there's actually a really good documentary on. And by good documentary, I just mean it goes into why there's a lot of frustration with the rating system with filmmakers in particular, because the guidelines for what makes something R versus PG-13 versus PG is somewhat or highly subjective to a council of people who basically watch movies and make decisions about them. There are lots of different cases you can bring up where it's like, well, this movie had this content in it, and that would be considered NC-17 for any other film. So how did this film get through? Is it a studio thing? Is it a bribery thing? Is it, all sorts of stuff. So that's what I mean when I say it's loaded. There's a lot there for, especially for filmmakers and studios and stuff. There's a lot there on that. My personal feelings on ratings, I think it is, or at least at the very least can be helpful to have some sort of like, hey, this is the kind of content you're gonna walk into in this movie. I grew up in a conservative household where ratings meant stuff for me for sure as a kid, right? Like you can't watch these, I cannot watch these. Maybe special exceptions here and there for certain films, but in my experience, it's been helpful at the very least to give some sort of dividing line. My issue with ratings is that it does not take the place of a parent. It does not take the place of a good critical eye. It does not take the place of really anything. And like in a lot of ways, it can give you an idea of what's coming, but it can't do its job. What it sort of claims to be able to do, it can't do its job.
Yeah, so ratings are a shorthand way of saying broadly this is what you're kind of looking at, but they are not specific enough. And so if you actually care about the content in a movie, then you go look up a review online that lists it all out. And there are tons of websites now that have, like play by play, here's what you're going to encounter. Do you want that for your kids or not? Right. So if you want to look at it for that reason, right. And what's interesting for me is that like general, it's good for everybody. And I'm like, not for my kids or nieces or nephews or, like there are films that are G, but like the peril is like too much for them. So like, maybe they're just not supposed to go to films. I don't know. So like there's this interesting thing there. And then I think one of the biggest like whatevers, and I've just never even seen the movie partially because of this, is a PG-13 movie, with breast shown, right? Like a Titanic or whatever, where you're like, okay, well, I feel like that would be in the R category, but like it's such a small amount that they're like, it's fine, right? Like there's some weirdnesses with that. And then also just kind of feeling like people felt shoehorned into it, like we've got to do this. It's a tool, but it's totally imperfect. And if you actually care about stuff, you'll look it up somewhere else. So that's my starting point.
Yeah, I mean, as far as guidelines go, PG-13 is such a wide gamut of being.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Wait, how is this a PG-13? It's not even barely has anything in it as far as I can tell. Like it's really, really tame. Holy crap, why wasn't that an R-rated film? Because you had all this stuff in it that was really harsh or dark and language filled and violent and just like that. I've seen R-rated movies that are tamer than that, right? And so that's where it really is this sort of. It is a shorthand that is really, really screwy. You can't use it as a true rating system. You don't really know. You can maybe get an idea, but you don't really know.
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting. And I think it's more interesting that it came up from the side of distribution rather than the side of actual production. Almost to the point where, the people making the films don't necessarily have much of a say. Obviously, we do get films where initially a film will get a rating and then they'll go back and re-edit it so that maybe it gets a lower rating and possibly gets a bigger audience to see it in the theaters because of that. So there is this kind of element of conflict between the people making movies and the people showing movies. I think it's interesting that the ratings specifically comes from that side of distribution and showing. Um, I don't know what difference it necessarily makes. I mean, I know that there is a theory out there that it relates more on the marketing side of things. Help me understand what movie ratings in terms of marketing would mean.
I think that there's a very, very, very strong connotation between, especially for the higher rated films, and by that I mean PG-13 R rating, of being a draw, not a restriction. There's, it's as in a sense dumb or primal or school level as like only the older kids get to do this, right? Like that's kind of a little bit of the marketing pool of say an R-rated movie, or at least it can be. There's also a level of for personal experience, R can mean really like it can be really stupid stuff. Like if I see a comedy and it's got certain people in it and it's got sort of a raunchy vibe to it and it's rated R, I already know what that movie is in a lot of ways, and I don't want to be anything near it. Like I don't care. I don't want to do that. It's going to be stupid jokes as far as I'm concerned. I don't want to do that. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're doing a pretty serious story about, I don't know, a war or something like that, there might be great stuff in all the different ratings you could do with that. But when you do an R-rated movie, I now know that movie's going to be, that's going to be in my face. There's going to be some violence. There's going to be some reality to this. So in my mind, R can either be really, really dumb or reality in a sense. Like it can be getting me somewhere that only an adult should be going to for a realness of a story. I like that aspect, but that's the thing. It can draw me to it because it makes me think this is going to be closer to where I think this story, like how this story should be told. And so I want to see the R-rated version of this story. That's a way to look at the marketing thing. Luke?
For me, PG-13 is typically where I'm like, I'm not interested unless it's, a pretty well-known like director or property or something where it's like, okay, I know that this is going to be a fun ride and they're going to push the envelope as far as they can, but it's going to be fun. Whereas in general, yes, comedies or whatever, if it's PG-13, it's like, why are you bothering? Right? Like, what are you doing? And by the time it gets to R, yeah, no comedies. What are you doing over here? Like, stop it. Unless it's one of the intellectual comedies, where it's because it's clever and funny and that kind of stuff, but it's also delving into hard stuff. And so I tend to like R-rated films because they tend to tackle topics that I'm interested in exploring, right, in a film. So that's where I kind of live. And then it's interesting because with G, I can have a great time in those movies, right? When it's a good animated film or whatever, like I love it. And then when you start dropping into PG, I'm like, what are you doing in this animated film putting this stuff in here? Like, where are you going? Right. So like the middle section is actually where I have the most like, I don't know about that. But I know that from a marketing perspective, theaters and studios really want their movies in the PG-13 if they're going to do a blockbuster or whatever. Like they can't go into R because you can't have people go to it. And a recent example of that is a film that Seth Rogen put together. And then like the kids who acted in the film technically can't go see the film, right? Because like it's got too much language, even though they were the ones who were doing the language, which pulls into another pet peeve of mine when it's like, we made this rated R because of language. I'm like, why? If you're not going to tackle difficult topics or like deal with like more adult stuff, I see swearing as like high school thing, which reminds me of an experience I had in high school where this kid was coming toward me in the hallway, just swearing up a storm. And I was like, are you a freshman, dude? And he's like, F yeah. And I was like, yeah, you can tell because you just got out of middle school and now you can like let loose. And so it's actually immature for me. And so I don't want any part of that.
Yeah.
And I would just like to reiterate that one of the major things, like we're talking about marketing, why would it have a connection to marketing on the very most basic level? Like we've been saying, PG-13 has a wider audience. I mean, it's truly demographics, right? Like there's just a very, very broad swath of demographic where it's just age based. Where if you're under 17, you can spend money on a movie because you're in high school. You can go see a movie, but you can't go see an R-rated movie without an adult. At least you're not supposed to be able to, right? So you have this big gap at least there where it's saying, hey, if you make an R-rated movie, you've taken the age range of your possible audience who can go see this movie on their own. You've shrunk it down from all the high schoolers who have free time to all the adults who don't. And so then what do you do, right? And at the same time, those of us who like movies and are adults are kind of like, yeah, but I really like those R-rated movies that are really interesting and deal with heavy adult subjects or whatever. They have a maturity about them. I like those stories. Doesn't mean that you can't have an adult story that has maturity that doesn't need to be R. You can totally have stories, PG-13, PG and G, that are very deep or interesting. Like you don't have to be R. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying there's a tendency for some of the subjects and ideas that I like to go into that R realm and for it to be an adult thing. And again, it's a demographic thing. You're not really, there are movies that are R-rated that are totally trying to draw on the teenager who's not supposed to be there or wants to go with his dad or whatever it may be, right, to go see this movie. But that's one brand of R. And there's the other brand of R, which is like, you're an adult, right? Okay, you can come watch this movie. Like that's like, there is that, yeah. But on the very base level, demographics. G has the widest possible demographic in the world, except that now G means kid movie. And PG means kid movie. So adults see G rating and may think to themselves, well, that's probably not for me. It's probably really tame or like doesn't really get deep, doesn't really get interesting. It's probably very surface level just for kids. I'm going to let that go, right? And then Pixar does something and then every adult goes anyway because Pixar's fantastic, right? But you have to earn that. And that's the thing. Pixar earned that. So anyway, just trying to say there is definitely a connotation along with a demographic reality that is what influences the marketing, like rating and marketing connection.
Yeah. I see the connection to your target audience, right? There's a certain reality where if you're putting a G movie out there, you're expecting a younger crowd. And then as you work your way up, the crowd gets older and older and older. And I mean, to a certain extent, that's fair. I think it's interesting to hear your guys' opinions specifically of, kind of where you live in the rating system. And I know I've made the comment on this show before that typically for me, R doesn't necessarily mean restricted, it means ruined. And yeah, there's a lot of movies out there that aren't necessarily going to fall into that. But when you get the comedies, especially as you mentioned, Luke, if it's rated R, it really is ruined. Like, why did you take the time to make this movie and put all this in there when you didn't need it? And so there's that aspect of it. You get the war movies too that are rated R, and to a certain extent, like depending on what the story is, I still think R can mean ruined, but it's a lot less likely because you are approaching that more difficult subject. And to put it closer to reality, to understand, especially in war movies, like war movies based on what we experienced in the world wars or something else, you can't get the reality of it without taking it to a point where it is rated R. And to think about life in that way, and even just apply it back to the situation that these people found themselves in, like we were sending young kids over to Europe to put them through this horrendous thing, and to not have a war movie like that rated R would almost be a disservice to a certain extent as well. So yes, my flippant comment is that R typically means ruined for me, but take that with a grain of salt as well.
I would also like to state that, Luke, you said you really get, or you have issues with PG-13 ratings, like that gets you disinterested. I think I know how you feel about, like, I think I maybe have some of the same feelings that you have on that, but I also know that I really don't too. Like PG-13, certainly growing up and into adulthood, a lot of my movies that I love are PG-13 rating, and I love it in part because they're doing stories with enough adult content and enough interest and enough depth to keep me there. And at the same time, they're not forcing themselves to go over the edge or to try to have an edge of language or violence or stuff that maybe could have happened. But like, Inception doesn't need to be overly violent or overly language filled to be a really, really great and adult movie. And I really appreciate that. I don't want Inception with like beheadings or something. Like I don't need that. I don't want that. And Lord of the Rings, right? That's a huge blockbuster, and it's a fantasy film, and of course, I love it for many different reasons. But that movie, it's got some hard stuff in a sense. Like you got some beheadings and stuff. For some people I know or have come to contact with, that's even a little much for them, right? For some people, it's like, wow, that an orc got beheaded. There was all this green goo that came out, and that's a little much for me. I'm like, really? That's I guess I'm getting jaded now, but I'm like, that is nowhere even close to the tip of the iceberg of what can happen, but it still gets the idea across, and it feels right. It doesn't feel like the movie has been neutered. It doesn't feel like the movie's been somehow on a story level or on a emotional, visceral, experiential level been somehow cut off at the knees because they didn't have the right rating. And there's a lot of movies there in that world that I really appreciate.
And it makes sense that there are a lot of movies in that because as we've been talking, that's demographics, right? So like tons of movies would fall in that. And I agree, right? Like there are a lot of good movies in that category. It's more when it becomes an issue of rating, right? Like this is a PG-13 comedy. Then you're like, oh yeah. And to your point, Scott, it's not even that like, why'd you feel the need to put that in there? It's why did you feel the need to make a movie that is here, right? Like, why do you need a PG-13 comedy? What are you doing with it, right? Like, I don't know what you're doing. And so it depends on where you go with it, right? What's your content? What's your topic? All that kind of stuff. And so that's where, okay, I want to shift to this in just a minute. But like, if I look back to like the golden era of cinema, like you don't have a rating system. You're just making movies every week and you're just pumping these things out. And some of those movies are phenomenal. And like, there's no content in them, right? Like from a content standpoint, but they're great. And they stand the test of time, right? So now we've kind of swung the other side now with like online streaming and all this stuff where we no longer have a rating, or if we do, it's like, hey, there's language and mature content and nudity in this thing, right? Like if you want that, keep watching, right? And so we're kind of in a different world now with streaming and television stuff. I will say the first time that I watched a cable show where people were like, you got to check out this show. And I was like, okay. So I pushed it and I was like, this is a television show where they're swearing and like have F-bombs everywhere. And I'm like, I don't want this for my television, right? Now I've watched Game of Thrones and blah, blah. So I'm like, whatever. But like, even then, like for me, that's more like, that's the online streaming thing that you're going to do. Like television, like needs to keep it, keep it back at class, like keep it classy. What are you doing? So well, that's my thought.
Here's interesting, just to riff off your last statement there. Keep it classy. That's a great idea. there are so many people who don't even know what that means, don't care, don't want to do that, right? Like there's such a complete divergence on that at the moment, and I love your statement about, yeah, there's lots of fantastic movies, adult, kid, whatever. Like there's so many great stories with great subject matter that the rating was never the thing that mattered, right? It was never about that or the content. And the rating system has a double-edged sword that of, on the one hand, potentially trying to in some way warn parents or whatever, or somewhat trying to police content, also makes it about the content more, or
Right.
at least it can, right? And that's always been an issue. You know, any advice that I would give to anybody who's interested in trying to, you know, walk through movies and what's good content versus bad content, ratings is never the thing I start with, right? It's always, I would extend to you that it should never be about the rating alone. It should always be about the content. It should always be about the subject matter. It should always be about the filmmaker. You know, books. What books are worth reading and not reading, right? And why? And there may be language, there may be also things going on, but it's about the subject matter, and it's about the author, it's about the ideals behind it that make it something worthy of your time or not. And more than that, potentially hindering or damaging to someone's psyche or not, like, you know, especially at different ages, right? So there are films that I saw way under 17 that were R-rated that actually bolstered my understanding of various things in the world in a good way, even though it was potentially hard or scary or whatever. But I, you know, and I'm me, and it's my parents, and you know, there's a relationship there, and there's going through that. You know, it's not that everyone should do what I did or vice versa, but subject matter in my world ends up becoming king because, like we said, you can do a G or PG movie with subject matter that has quote unquote no content that I can find incredibly destructive, ugly, wrong, messed up, hurtful to everyone. And so it is one of those things where, as we talk about ratings and we talk about this new world of streaming too, the interesting thing about streaming and the sort of like what TVMA now is sort of like MA mature, where we've got like a sort of new more nebulous rating, and to some extent, you really do have to think about things in terms of content. Do you let your kid watch The Haunting of Hill House? Probably not, because it's called The Haunting of Hill House. Like, get an idea of what that story is about. But I think it's a fantastic story. But at what age are you suddenly allowed to watch that story? It's all subject matter. It's all walking through it, right?
Yes.
Like, how do you figure that out? And that's
Right.
where, as a parent, I would recommend seeing it and then deciding, right? Because you got to have some level of, you got to have some base ground. You can't outsource it.
So
Right.
you,
And
I mean,
the
you
rating
brought up-
helps a parent say, look, no R until this age, right? Like I can just make that and I don't have to think about it anymore, right? But like different kids can access content at different times, and that is one of those challenges of being a parent. Sorry, Scott, cutting you off.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think you lead right into the next question that I really wanted to ask is, to an extent, does ratings become a form of censorship in both TV and film? Like, is the rating system overstepping its bounds in that sense, or should it be doing more of that?
My answer is I'm not sure if it's quote unquote censorship, because when I think of censorship, I come from film school and art world stuff where like censorship's the big evil. How dare you censor my art? If you censor my art, you're like taking away freedom of speech and that kind of stuff. I would say this instead of censorship. I would say that the rating system is another great example of the human race and our culture in particular trying to outsource thinking, trying to say, hey, somebody else figured this out for me, or somebody else tell me what's okay, or somebody else teach my kids, or somebody else handle this. And whether we asked for that as a culture or not, or somebody thought that we should do that for people, we need to handle the subject for people. I think the biggest issue of it can be censorship at times, can also not be, but it's more in my mind a it's too generic. It's this problem of you're trying to make a group of people or an organization make a statement that is somehow going to affect everyone's ability to watch this or not, And that is never, ever going to answer the questions that are really trying to be addressed there. I mean, what the real question I guess I have is why do it? If I recall, there was something in the history of this where it was sort of like, well, either we make an organization to do it to relegate us or like to regulate us as movies, or the government does it. And we don't want the government to do it, so we'll just make our own organization so that we can do it, right? And I understand that thinking if the government's going to do it, but it comes again from this place of some authority thought at some point that they needed to get involved and say what was okay for kids to watch or not. And there needs to be strong arguments for that, but really, I always think that's the parents' job, you know. So I don't subscribe. Anyway,
Well, I don't like coming up with new thoughts or thinking about things, Jonathan. So I'll just go with that. No, I'm just kidding. The rating system for me is a broad brush starting point tool for audience goers or the people who want to control the audience because they're the parent or whatever, right? So it's a starting place. It is definitely not the conclusion of that or censorship or anything like that. It is a restriction, kind of the way like you can't drink until this age. Now, is that a good idea? Well, let's look at Europe versus America as far as beer consumption in youth and blah, blah, right? Like we can look at all that kind of stuff. So that might be an important discussion at some point in time. But for me, the rating system is a completely imperfect tool that is a starting place for busy parents who say, I'm not sure. I don't got time for this, right? And so that's where I start.
So is it possible, like what, based on that thought, Luke, though, like what else could we do to this rating system to actually make it a more useful, accurate tool? I mean, I know they're trying to add hey, this got rated PG-13 for violence, or hey, this was rated PG-13 for language. I mean, is that stuff helpful, or what is the change that needs to happen to make it a more useful tool?
Well, I think Jonathan's already said it really well, right? Like, okay, if your family is going to be offended by swearing or by, dirty jokes or whatever, well then having it say crude humor helps you say I don't want to see this movie, right? But if you are looking for a more nuanced perspective, you have to watch it yourself, or you have to go look at a website where they've listed everything for you, where they say, a man's butt is shown, a woman is shown undressing, but you don't see anything because it's in shadows. Like there are websites that will spell all that out for you. So if you're not sure, go look that up.
And this is sort of backtracking just a little bit, but to your point of censorship and to Luke's point of the streaming world, the internet changed everything as it was. And there's just like this is the other thing is whatever restrictions that ratings ever really like the control that may have been there, the level of kids may have actually been carded and not allowed to go see a movie, for instance, was already getting around in those days because you snuck in or you got someone to get you in or whatever it may have been. But even then, nowadays, I don't know that you can censor. Right? Like nowadays, there's the internet and there's streaming. And the only thing that can happen is a relationship between a parent and a child and rules and stuff in that house and whatever that parent is willing to do to try to stop or restrict content. Because when it comes to the resources available, whether you're pirating a movie or streaming something or whatever it may be, the censorship is almost impossible at this rate. You can't, even that restricting control in the way that it used to maybe restrict some audiences is no longer viable, really.
Yeah.
It just isn't.
It blows me away when I encounter a website where there is adult material that's just like right there. Like just no warning or anything, just bam, it's there. And I even see this on YouTube where like somebody's just, and I'm fine with it because I'm an adult, but like, somebody's just swearing up a storm and I'm like, this is literally available to anybody. Like they could just click play and it's here. Like this is crazy. And I think one of my favorite things, and I don't remember what I saw it on, but it was somebody who's just giving a rant about something. And then he's like, oh my goodness, yes, I was born in 1960. As he's clicking on, he's like, just get me to the content. So like, yeah, are you gonna actually be able to censor or anything like that? Like,
Well, this brings up the case of VidAngel to me and other services. Like I think Vudu's even doing this now, where you can choose like a family plan and choose what kinds of curse words you don't want to be heard, or what violent thing you may not want to see. And you have this whole list in your streaming service now being like, I want to watch The Matrix or something, but don't ever want to hear the S word. So all the S words better be bleeped out or cut out of this movie. And we've got algorithms and stuff now, right, where you can do that. And you can get specified even to that level. So on the other side of it, that may be a very useful tool for some people. It may be a great tool for some people, right?
Absolutely. Especially if that's your barometer. Like, does this exist? Is the barometer? Well, that's great for you. If you are more nuanced, where you're like, what kind of context is this in? Then you have to go watch it.
Right. And I thought about, you remember, okay, so I don't have TV anymore because I find TV to be one of the most antiquated things going on right now because we have streaming services. So I do not have cable. I don't have that anymore. But you guys remember the good old fashioned edited for TV movie? So here's...
Oh, they're still out there.
Oh, I know. And they may have even gotten better at it. But those versions of films irritate me, especially the better the film, because they edit down for multiple things, not just content, like not just language or whatever, but they edit down also for time, right? And that's when I start to get irritated. I start to get irritated when you take The Matrix and you cut out a scene that may actually be important because that entire movie is actually really good. So every scene actually matters. And so you cut it out because you're just trying to make your time limit, or you cut the content entirely. So you miss the context of why that content was even there in the first place. There's a context for the whole thing. That's when I start to get irritated. And it's not, again, censorship, not like a dictator saying, I'm censoring this so you don't know about this, but just you miss the movie. You miss something important. You miss the whole experience. That's where I start to get irritated, where a scene's just missing because X, Y, or Z reason.
Yep. Said like a true artist, if I do say so myself. I think we can kind of come to a general conclusion that we have this rating system, but in all of our opinions, the bottom line is go out there and do more research on your own. We live in a time when the information is there, so take advantage of it, people. On that note, we're going to wrap up the show. Guys, what recommendations do you have for our viewers?
I just thought I'd think of one of my first R-rated movies. I mean, there's different milestones in different places, but one of the first R-rated movies that I ever saw was a movie called Glory. And Glory is a movie from the 90s. It's a Civil War film starring Matthew Broderick and Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman. And it's about the first black regiment that was made in the war that was on the Northern Union side. And it's an excellent film. It's well done. It's got good themes, good character, good stuff going on in there. An excellent score. There is definitely some violence going on and some heavy subject matter going on. That's why it's rated R. But that was one of those first R-rated movies I remember that I saw in one way or another. I think it's very good. So, if you're interested in taking a leap into the R-rated world of Civil War films from the 90s, there you go. Check out Glory.
I'm not going to recommend these movies, but I actually watched Clockwork Orange, which apparently was NC-17 or X or whatever back in the day, and I was like, oh, okay, whatever. And then I will say, I personally enjoyed, for the most part, the documentary This Film Is Not Yet Rated. Now, I will say, I liked the conspiracy theory of like, oh, they didn't rate it, or they would have rated it NC-17 because they didn't like the fact that it was like going behind the curtain on all this. But no, it's rated, like if it was rated, it'd be rated NC-17 because they show clips from NC-17 rated movies to compare it to R-rated movies and say, what's the difference between this? Why does one get what and why does the other, right? So it even has like a hump counter at one point in time, which I found hilarious. But like, just know this is not a kid's thing, okay? Like, this is serious, like adult stuff that you'll be getting yourself into. But I enjoyed it because, here we are.
There you go. And in the vein of Luke talking so much about comedies in this episode, I did want to recommend a comedy that I always find enjoyable and yet has some moments of crude humor in it. So my recommendation is the movie Dodgeball. If you're looking for a good laugh, that's one that I can always count on to laugh. And just remember, if you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball.
I'd like to inject one last thought. If you are struggling to figure out the whole rating thing, you're struggling to figure out what to see, what not to see, or whatever, there's a reason why reviewers are actually they can be a good thing. And I don't mean that in the gross, like Rotten Tomatoes or even a publisher. Like, find people you trust who have seen the movie. Find people you understand and love or care about, or who love and care about you, and you have a relationship and you know where each other stand, and talk to them and hear what they have to say about it if you're not sure if you want to see it or not. That is one of the most valuable ways of doing it. It doesn't just have to be your parents. It doesn't have to just be, find friends who've done it that you trust. Scott and Luke have differing opinions about lots of things, but I know them and I trust them. And so when they see a movie and I haven't seen it, I can talk to them about it, get their thoughts on it, and I get a much better picture of what the content is, what's going to go down. I can ask more specific questions. So just, use resources, talk to people, have friends that do that. That's good.
Well, thanks for joining us tonight, folks. We'll see you again next time.
I give this a rating of like 2.5 stars, maybe.
I think it's rated R for Ruin since Scott was on it.
Oh,
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. PG-13.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.